Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Paul North, a professor of Germanic language and literature at Yale. He has written numerous articles and books, including The Problem of Distraction. He is also co-editor of IDIOM, Inventing Writing Theory, a book series at Fordham University Press. Today we'll talk with Professor North about his new book, The Yield, Kafka's Atheological Reformation. Welcome, Professor North.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you here with us today, and this should be, I'm sure, a very interesting topic for us today. So let's begin with your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the book is a presentation of a very strange text written by Franz Kafka, who most people know. They've read him in America, at least in high school, some creepy stories. But in 1917, responding to a lot of pressures and changes in his environment in Prague, he wrote a theoretical text, which to my mind is on par with the great philosophical and theoretical texts of the European tradition. Mm-hmm. So this book reconstructs this text, which tells you what the basic elements of reality are. It tells you what to do in your life. It tells you where humanity is headed. All sorts of big questions are answered by Kafka in this book.
Okay, and is this a book that, has it been published or no?
His book?
Yeah, this
so he
text.
wrote this, the text is a strange text. It was a set of thoughts that occurred to him over half a year while he was staying outside of Prague on a sort of small farm that his sister was living on. And he devoted himself to the state of mind in which thoughts would occur to you. In some sense, being away from Prague, away from his commitments, stopping writing fiction allowed him to have these thoughts, but they're preserved only as individual thoughts. So my book reconstructs the whole schema in which they make sense as a critique of European commitments.
Okay, and how did you become interested in the topic? What led you to write this book?
What led me to write the book? So I would say three things. One is I've worked a lot in this period in European thought, and there was a general sense that everything was going downhill. This is the early 20th century in Middle Europe, between the wars. World War I was a kind of game changer for people's attitudes towards the tradition, and what happened, all the instability that happened between them, also brought up a kind of a need for formulating a new way of living in Europe. New political theories were being born, new philosophical systems were being born, but no one had investigated Kafka's. So it seemed to be calling out for a reconstruction. Also, it presents a very, very odd new perspective on things.
And how so?
Well, the aim of Kafka's treatise in Thoughts is to convince us not to do anything.
Not to do anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
To do as little as possible, or you could say even less than nothing.
And why is he telling us this?
It is a bit of a strange response to everything he was experiencing and everything he had read. The tradition he felt and a lot of people had felt had come to a dead end, the European tradition, but Kafka was, at least nominally, through his family, Jewish, and had this very strange sort of three-sided identity problem. He was a German speaker in Prague among Czech speakers, and a Jew among German speakers, and a Kafka among humanity. And you might understand a little bit about that if you've read some of Kafka's writings. He was, his imagination kept him outside of most of the political and social norms that we take for granted. So there were responses to these problems: what to do with Europe, what to do with the tradition, what is an intellectual to do in a time of great upheaval, but also what should the Jews do? And one of the main responses was political Zionism. Go to Palestine and establish a state like other European states. And Kafka, being Kafka and having this three-sided identity problem, didn't commit to any of those solutions to what he saw as a very dire situation. All of his friends, the novelist Max Brod, his friend Felix Welch, who was a philosopher, were involved in Zionist projects of one sort or another. They were in the circle of people listening to Martin Buber, who was a cultural Zionist, but political Zionism, that is establishing a state outside of Europe, was still a very powerful idea. Kafka said no to all of these things. He also said no to being a kind of building a Jewish community in diaspora. He thought that building anything was exactly what the Jewish Bible taught not to do. So what he does in this set of thoughts is he goes back to the Jewish Bible, goes back to the book of Genesis, and he starts pulling out lessons from there that are absolutely opposite to what everyone else was doing in the day, advocating a move, an establishment of a state, or building a Jewish culture in diaspora.
So can you cite any of the text he was pulling to?
Sure, I can tell you a little bit about the central one. He was
Okay.
very concerned with the myth of paradise. Myth, the story of paradise, the legend of paradise, this very central biblical tale. And he spends a long time in his treatise and thoughts showing that the logic of paradise simply doesn't hold up. One of the thoughts is something like this. If paradise could have been destroyed, then it wasn't paradise. If it was destroyed, then, wait, no.
Yes.
So much for my memory. If paradise was destroyed, then it wasn't paradise. If it wasn't destroyed, then we were never expelled from paradise to begin with. The point is that the history that seems to go from this initial fall and then develop into human history with its idea of progress can't possibly be true. If that's the case, we shouldn't act in order to make things better because there's no trajectory of history from a fall to redemption. And that's mainly the central argument of the book, that if you read Genesis carefully, this is Kafka's peculiar reading of Genesis, if you read it carefully, there is no paradise at the beginning and no redemption at the end.
Okay. So let's talk about the book title, The Yield. Why did you select that as the title?
Yield is a word that I'm using to describe Kafka's advice. Kafka's advice is a certain kind of not acting.
Okay, so to yield.
To yield.
Okay.
And yielding is the yield, the product of thinking through these thoughts with him. And yielding for him means a couple of things. It doesn't mean simply practicing nonviolence, because for him nonviolence is already within a framework of trying to improve the state by, let's say, different means. Kafka is really thinking of a different kind of community than a state. And so nonviolence might be part of a rebellion, for example, of a people against a state to achieve a certain end. But Kafka's imagining a yielding way of living that would more or less ignore the state altogether.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about his writings. Tell us a little bit more about, some of his ideas that you came across in doing this book.
So Kafka really developed as a writer once he got his day job working for the Workers' Accident Insurance Company in Prague. That's the Austro-Hungarian version of our OSHA. They, at that time, negotiated between businesses and workers to try and keep the workers safe and the businesses paying into the insurance fund so that they could cover injured workers. And Kafka, before that, he had been writing in this very expressionist style of the day, and things really changed when he started writing insurance texts. Although he hated his job, it really changed his own style. It became the kind of uncanny Kafkan style, where the style doesn't express the strangeness of what's happening in the stories. because he was a lawyer and working in this agency, he encountered a lot of oddities about the law, about its application, about its interpretation. And the first half of his stories have a lot to do with the law, and also another minor motif in his early stories and novels are families, and particularly fathers. Mm-hmm. But around this time, when he writes this set of thoughts, things change and he starts to think about power. So I think he realized that behind these questions of legitimacy, legality, interpretation, and behind the institution of the family and the father with his particular mode of legislating the family stood these questions about authority and power that were even more nefarious and strange, ultimately, than the law itself. And he starts with this text really shifting to something like a critique of power. And his recommendation in this text is simply not to use power, not to use it at all. Mm-hmm. This I take to be the most radical claim in these texts. The texts themselves are fragmentary, they're highly puzzling. Mm-hmm. They take a long time to figure out. It took many, many years to organize them and see how they're related to one another. But basically, they are thoughts like you or I would have thoughts in the form that we would have them, written down directly from the event of having thoughts in their most puzzling form and left that way.
Can you tell, are they chronological? Is there a way to tell when they're written? Does
yes,
he date
he
them?
Dates them. He dates them and he reworks them when he selects the ones he wants potentially to publish, although like most of Kafka's writings, they were never published and never even sent to a publisher. And then they belong to the collection of papers that he asked his friend Max Brod to burn at the end of his life.
Who of course didn't.
Because he didn't, because he was lucky enough either to misunderstand that request of Kafka's or to understand it too well. We have all of this great Kafkan material.
And where are these papers today?
The papers, except for two of them, are held at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. I was there doing some research, and he wrote them on little pieces of paper called settle, and before that he had written them down in small notebooks that he carried with him on his perambulations in a small town.
So you would go to the library and read through them, and pretty amazing. So let's go back to the power, to eschew power.
Yeah.
Did he talk about, if you eschew power, what might happen or what should happen or what society would be like?
Right, yeah. Obviously he didn't foresee the Shoah. This was in 1917, so it was before anything like that had entered anyone's imagination. Some people's imagination, perhaps, but nothing further than that. And I don't think he was thinking of it as a political solution, but as a way of behaving in a situation in which there was no clear solution, in which any response to anti-Semitism, to oppression, just strengthened the powers of oppression. So what could you do? Kafka really was a kind of logician, and he thought of these things as almost as mathematical problems. And his solution to the problem was this practice of yielding, which was a personal practice, but he looked around and he saw it at work in nature. He saw it at work in history. How does anything ever change? Well, some state of affairs has to give up its position as preeminent. So this is much more of a theoretical position on Kafka's part than, let's say, a practical one.
Right, okay.
He did envision at the same moment what he called the possessionless workforce. And part of these texts are a critique of possession, a critique of private property, all the way up to the idea of even having anything. Really, yielding means giving up that kind of greedy grasp of anything, including language or your cultural conventions. Kafka was very extreme in his thoughts. So he wrote this, what he called the possessionless workforce, in which he designed a society that was subsistence-based, where any extra of anything went to the poor, only the healthy worked, and only a certain amount of hours enough to provide the basic needs of the society. Kafka was not a very sophisticated student of the history of social forms, but in his kind of pure theorization of the answer to this problem, the problem of power, how to live in a world in which your actions don't perpetuate power, he came up with this idea.
Okay, after the Yield, it's Kafka's Atheological Reformation.
Right.
What are you meaning by that?
Okay, so Kafka had a particular relationship to religious thought. In the Jewish Zionist movements, there was always some taking the past seriously and taking central texts and ideas from Judaism seriously. Kafka did the same thing. But what he found when he went back to Genesis was something that didn't make sense. And you could say, in the tradition of the textual critique of the Bible, that there are many different editors working there and different strands of the Bible woven together, and the contradictions in the text arise from that. But Kafka saw them as logical contradictions. What he saw was that the basic tenets of European religions, let's say Christianity and Judaism, to speak very loosely, because these are huge traditions that all have all sorts of contradictory elements at all sorts of different moments in history anyway. But to say that very roughly, Judaism and Christianity, that they begin from confused principles. So Kafka's Atheological Reformation is a critique of the use of these principles by leading them back to their confused origins, one of them being this question of paradise. The paradise idea is confused. It can't possibly be. If it was, it wouldn't have been destroyed, so we would be living in paradise now. If it wasn't paradise, then it was never destroyed. We never lived in paradise, and we have no reference to paradise to begin with. This is the kind of originary confusion that Kafka thinks drives a lot of the violence and ideology in European history. So he thinks if you can critique these and draw them back to an originary confusion, people can stop acting on the basis of principles that don't make sense. The way to act on the basis of principles that don't make sense is to yield, to give up acting, at least in any way that we recognize it.
Right, right. Okay, so your book is a little bit, or actually very different from, the thoughts on Kafka that are out there. Let's talk about that. How is this book different from others?
There are a few books that deal with Kafka as a thinker, as a theorist, and even the books that deal with his literature, his literary writings, have to confront someone who is obviously thinking very profoundly about certain philosophical questions. But basically, Kafka criticism falls into two camps. Those who are fascinated by Kafka the person and go through his biography to try to imagine how someone like this could have come to be. And the other is those who are fascinated with Kafka the writer, who think of some kind of magic of writing and go through his writing and his comments on writing to see how this sort of writing could have come to be. And those are interesting questions and really illuminate Kafka, but I'm interested in the Kafkan results. There's a small body of work that has the same interest, but this doesn't involve treating Kafka as a philosopher exactly. It really involves taking his writing seriously as unique, as literary, as being as much tied up with the language as it is with some abstract idea of a thought. Certainly the language is very important. But we can learn a lot from Kafka, let's say that. And many people have emphasized the parabolic nature of Kafka's stories, or the possibility that one could always interpret them yet again. And I don't think that's the case. I think Kafka had a project. So I feel like it's my mission in this book to present Kafka's project for a world in which the kinds of conflicts that Kafka saw have not diminished at all. Certainly not in Europe.
Well, Fascinating. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
It was a pleasure.
For more information about Professor North and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.